So what I normally do is put my shutter cocking rack in place, put my 1/4 feeler gauge in place, slacken that screw off, push it back towards the back of the camera, tighten the screw up, check that the arm is still square because it's usually not, manipulate it as I want, and check that again, see if I've succeeded. No, I've got far too much clearance there now. Let's try that again. If this seems a bit hit and miss, it's because it is a bit hit and miss. But you get it right. Once it's right, you're good. Check that square. That feels good. Get that screw up a bit tighter. Check it's still square. That moves freely. There's not undue amount of clearance there. That's exactly what I want. And normally I put a drop of lacquer on the head of that screw to keep everything from shifting. Okay, well that's good. Now here, my felt light trap thing here is flapping loose. Normally that's glued to the inside of this. But for one reason or another it's stuck to the leather instead. That's fine, just as long as it stays in one piece while I move things. So I'm just going to put a spot of glue on there and just fix it down. Don't be overly concerned about that felt light seal. It wasn't even present on some of the models. Alright, that's looking pretty good. Now where's the shutter release piece I'm looking for? This one. This piece here fits in on here, because there's no spring to hold it in place or keep it under tension and it's prone to falling out. To get it hooked into position. Like that. If I collapse this slightly, it's trapped in there, it can't fall out easily now. I can put this shroud assembly in place in the body. And we have our 2 screws at the top, 2 screws at the bottom. And we should be good to go. This is an earlier camera, and as such those threaded holes go straight into the aluminium housing. On intermediate cameras they had a pressed in nickel plated bush instead, and on the later cameras they went back to doing it this way, which would have been cheaper, and with the benefit of hindsight they probably decided was adequate. I'll do those 4 screws up tight because they were loose when we started. That's the front all in. Now here I want to get my tripod socket in place. This little insert holds the base of your film cassettes. And there's our tripod socket. There's 3 screws, and they're fairly easy to recognise because they're the only screws of that particular length. There's the lucky last. Whoops, come back. Right, I'll do those up tight. That's good. So the focus mount. Now that's been through the cleaner, and these brackets are a bit light as a result, so I'm just going to touch them up with a bit of black paint from a paint pen. That'll do nicely. That can fit in place. Just drop that into the front standard. That's fixed in with 4 nickel plated screws. Small round tops on them. I've got to be careful doing this, that this shutter release piece doesn't fall out, because the way everything's pushed back into the body, it's not currently supported. Where's the 4th of those screws? There it is, hiding. That's an imaginary doorbell. It's a wireless doorbell and it gets set off at random intervals. I happen to know from the sound of that there's nobody on the other end of that one. Okay, that's looking good. Next I can assemble my focus mount. Alright, here's the inner and outer helical. Get them started, see what we're like for alignment, see how far out we are. Well, we're well out, half a turn at least. Let's have another look. Where's that single? What's over there? No, more. There we go. Now at that point, you can see my alignment marks. I've got 2 alignment marks across here, 1 here and 2 here, and they're lined up when the front surface of the inner and outer are level with each other. So I know that that's the correct position for that to be in. I'm just going to run a bit of naphtha on there and work this. This has all been through the cleaner. There may be a bit of oxidation or something on those surfaces still. And I'll find put a bit of naphtha on there, run the 2 surfaces together. It just polishes away. That's fine. Or I can lubricate that with a bit of helical grease. So I'll back it out most of the way. I want to spot on around 5 or 6 areas around the perimeter. You don't need to pack the threads with grease. A little bit goes a long way. Just run that in. That's nice and smooth. I want some around the outside here where it sits in the front stand, in that focus mount there in the front standard. And there are two rails here and here, and where they slide in here they need a touch of grease. There and there. Now I know which way up this is because I always put a single line at the top and a double line at the bottom. Check that that moves smoothly. That all looks good. The retainer goes on there. Now I'll just wipe around the inside edge of that retainer with the same grease since I've got it here. You can usually see 4 bright spots. That's where it's under pressure from the fixing screws. And that is held in place with 4 small countersunk head screws. That's not picking up, that's not the right screw. I know what that's for, that's not for there at all. Let's find these screws. Here I have them. That other screw was from the top cover. That's one of the 2 screws that would have held the dial, the settings dial for the meter, onto the top cover at one stage. One of the screws is missing, and that's going to prove a problem because those screws are an unusual size. They are very short. They have quite a small head for their thread size, and there's not many other screws around like that that I can easily grab, so I'll just contract that whole arrangement. We'll put the 4 screws in that hold the bellows to the back of the front standard. They're the longer black screws. The front of the bellows has a metal plate in there, a steel plate, that has threaded holes for these screws. Okay, so that's in place. Let's check that that moves smoothly. It does. And where is the focus scale ring? Let's put that in place. Of course, we have our alignment marks that I'd scribe here and here, so I know exactly where that's to go. And there are 4 screws that hold this in place. They are not countersunk. Don't over tighten the screws in this position because you'll just end up distorting something and then the focus won't move smoothly. Making sure my alignment marks look good. So these screws just need to be nipped up lightly. If you start cranking on them, you end up with a load of grief. That looks good. And the connecting arm for our rangefinder is here. Now this is riveted at that joint, and it usually stiffens up after it's been cleaned because there's no lubricant in there, so I put a tiny drop of oil on there. It's the only oil I ever use in these. I'll just put a drop of oil there. Put that out of harm's way. Just work that once or twice, that oil just goes straight into that joint and then that arm moves freely. Get that in position. Of course, it wasn't easy to get out, was it? It's no easier getting it back. I don't know who invented the geometry for that particular part. Those two screws, and there's one at the top that couples to the rangefinder. That done up. Make sure it all moves freely. That looks good. Now put a little touch of grease in that track. So the transfer shaft here. So we have a bush. We have the transfer shaft. I'll put some grease in the centre, some at the top, just a tiniest smear on the other outside face, and that couples to the shaft that we'd put in the body, just checking that everything's coupled and everything's revolving. That looks good. A chrome shroud that goes over that, and there's two chrome screws. One's easy to get at over here. The other one, whoops, don't drop it into the body. That could have been a disaster. The other one sits down in here. Check that this doesn't rub on the focus scale ring. It appears to move smoothly enough. That's good. Now you notice I've dropped in the shutter release shaft temporarily while I was doing that. That's to make sure that that other little piece in there didn't have the opportunity to fall out and cause me trouble. Now the film rewind I'd like to assemble at this point. We've already got the bush in the body. Just something down in there. Is that this a screw? Yeah, I thought it was. I would have been regretting it if I couldn't find that screw. Right, so some synthetic grease on here. This is the inner. It slides up into here. It's keyed so it only fits in one direction, and that prevents the two from rotating together. And a bit of synthetic grease on here. This shaft is somewhat well worn. That's okay. Not called upon to do an awful lot. We'll slide that up through the bush. Just lift that tab slightly so it'll go underneath it. There we go. We can check what that looks like in the top cover now, see if that hole's somewhat more centred. Yeah, it does look a bit more centred than it previously did, so I'm quite confident that'll be fine. At this stage I'm going to completely assemble the shutter release shaft because it has a spacer and a tiny washer that goes on there. I want all of those together and in their correct places, and there's a return spring. There's our return spring. Where's our spacing collar? There it is. Okay, so taking some molybdenum paste. First thing I want to do is make sure that that piece is not going to get away. So I have that sitting like that. Rub some molybdenum paste on my shutter release shaft. Drop that in carefully from the top. Underneath the, oh hang on, let's just back up a step. Put the collar on. Put our little spacer on the shaft. Feed that in from the top carefully. Fit our return spring in place. Now, don't want to drop this because it'll fall down in between the shroud and the bellows, and you're going to pull everything apart to get it back out. And if you're feeling lazy and you don't feel like getting it back out, it'll hide in the corner until you're not looking, and it'll find its way into some inconvenient place, and you won't be able to either open the front of the camera, or you may not be able to close the front of the camera, but it'll be one of them. That's very good. Now, to make sure my shutter release doesn't get away, I'm going to put my strap lug on the end there and stretch a rubber band across there so that it can't get away. Turn around there for good measure. That'll just stop that from being able to fall out and cause me grief. So that opens and closes nicely. Focus scale ring moves nicely. We could put the front door on next, I suppose. Yeah. The button on that's a little bit sticky. That seems to be fine. Right, some synthetic grease. Some synthetic grease here and here. Take our door, slide the arms into there. Now there are two hinge pins which I need to find. Now this one had a washer at the top and nothing at the bottom. A spacer, slide that in right on the hinge pin line, make sure everything's lined up. Take my hinge pin screw, run that in, tighten that up, flip the camera up, a hinge pin screw for the bottom. Now this one's recognisable because it's somewhat black looking, which is either corrosion or it's adhesive or leatherette or both. Tighten that up. So now the camera opens and closes, the focus is smooth, shutter release is nice and floppy, which is exactly as it should be, and the camera is ready to have the film advance mechanism, etc. fitted back. Okay, so let's get this film advance mechanism reassembled in some fashion. Well, I was going to do it until I lost the spring. No, there it is. Okay, so first this spring to go on the release lever. Can you see anything? No, you can't see anything. That's alright, that's normal. Let's get that spring over that boss. Nice and neat. Taking my molybdenum paste, I'll give that a wipe where the levers are going to run, and the spring has to run on that surface, so that needs to have some too. Round here and round here. Easy. Where's the lock lever? The lock lever goes in there. There are two small springs, look quite similar. One is smaller diameter wire than the other, and that's the one we use on the lock lever. I'm taking the circlip, the E clip or the C clip, depending on where you live. That goes on there. Here is the release lever. Drop that in. Take great pains not to mutilate that spring. They're thin on the ground. And it's even worse if you damage it. Think it's okay, put the camera together, and then it snaps a month later. Right, put the screw in the top, run that down a bit. That will be a good start. Just check the height of that relative to my shutter release. That's probably in a bit far actually. Let's just back that out a turn. That's a good place to start. The film advance shaft. Now this camera had a bit of a hiding. It had obviously been dropped on its head at some stage. The rewind shaft was pushed over. The bush was bent. The knob on the top, the screw that holds the knob on the top was bent. The meter dial had been wiped off the top cover. And there were possibly other signs of minor abuse, or the meter flap didn't want to close properly. Okay. So it's generally not all that flash. That's okay, we can make it work. Now I'm taking some graphite grease and I'm going to lubricate this. Now pulling back that spring, you'll see that probably that there's a groove worn in the shaft at that point. It's been worn in there by the last coil of the spring, and I want to get some grease into that, around that shaft to go up into the bush, so I'm working that in. This graphite grease sticks quite well to that shaft, leaves it covered. Run some into the coils of the spring. Doesn't need much, it's just so that those coils are inclined to move smoothly over each other when they're under tension, which they will be. Now I normally lubricate the cam on the bottom of the film advance with some synthetic grease because it's cleaner and tidier, and I've got it here, so I'm doing it just like that. You want the take-up spool, the bush for the take-up spool, and 3 screws, which should be nice and clean because I've never seen glue, and the heads will be not mutilated because people haven't been mutilating them trying to get the glue and rubbish off the bottom. Okay, just like that. And so it begins. Right, our take-up spool. Let's put the bush in the bottom of the take-up spool. That's the round hole, not the one with the slot in it. And just turn this so I can see the holes. It's going to be there. Now the slot on that guide bush there normally goes towards the end of the camera, like that. To get that seated in the take-up spool, and if you've done everything right, the take-up spool will be sitting neatly over the spring, not sticking up at an angle like that, so that's not right. That spring is not seated into the bush properly. Means that the spring is not sitting in that little groove as it should. And then I've got to try and get that thing right. It ain't going. Alright, take that out and start again. Swing that lock lever out of the way, swing the release lever out of the way, get that out. What the hell's going on here? That spring there, instead of sitting neatly there, it wrapped over the top so it wouldn't go down in the slot. It means the end of that spring is slightly misshapen. Well, the chances of unmisshapening that are not good, so it's going to go back in like that, regardless of its enthusiasms or lack thereof. It doesn't feel right. Oh, it is right. Okay, it's seated. The spring went where it was supposed to go. The screw holes are lined up. I'll get a screw run in there. Drop the other 2 in. And get them in there. Now they're nickel plated screws. Don't put the chrome plated screws from the top cover in there, because you're not going to like it when you put the top cover back in place and you've only got rough looking nickel plated screws to hold it down. Right, all 3 screws are in position. I can tighten those screws up. Good. And the sprocket's sitting exactly as the shaft, take-up spool sitting exactly as it should. Right, the clutch assembly for the top. Have the centre piece, the spring, and the outer piece. I like to lubricate this with the graphite grease because I like the the tacky feel of it, the way it sticks to the inside of this clutch. So that the edges of this spring are not carving into it, galling the metal, which they certainly will, given half a chance. Right, where are the pliers?